Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay, so please find a seat and take your seats if you would, and we'll get started. My name is Peter Matheson. I'm the principal of the university, so I'm the first to welcome you to this event, and I'm going to look at my phone, not because I'm doing my email, but because I've got a few notes about people that I need to remember to thank. Most important message for me tonight is just to welcome everybody, both here in the Playfair Library at the University of Edinburgh, and indeed joining us online from wherever they are. Bit of housekeeping for those people here. There are no scheduled fire alarms. If there is an alarm, there are two fire exits, one in the back left corner of the room next to the entrance and one through here on the right. You should go down the stairs and exit via the push bar doors, which will take you outside into the wonderful Edinburgh weather where fires won't last very long. The assembly points will be either in South College Street, which is over there, or the underpass at Potter Row, which is over in the far corner, depending on which stairwell you leave from. So, bathroom facilities, for those of you that don't know the building, the ladies' bathroom is on this floor, just outside there, and the men's is downstairs, back towards the front door, and there'll be staff around to guide you. So just to briefly introduce this evening's events, one of the things that we're rather proud of at the University of Edinburgh and in Edinburgh more generally is what we describe as convening power. We think Edinburgh as a city and the University of Edinburgh as an institution within that city have something rather valuable that we call convening power. And the Edinburgh conversations that you're about to hear the latest iteration of are the modern manifestation of that convening power. And it takes inspiration from the Edinburgh conversations of the 1980s, when at the height of the Cold War, Professor John Erickson, who at the time was Professor of Politics at the university, convened talks between the United States and the Soviet Union in an effort to bring peace and reconciliation and end the Cold War. So that's the background, the Edinburgh conversations, and we've pirated the name alongside the development of something called the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which I hope you've already heard of, and if you haven't, you'll hear more of in the next few years, I hope. And tonight's closing remarks will be given by my colleague, Professor Chris Speed, who is the director of the Edinburgh Futures Institute. And it's with the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which, to cut a very long story short, will be based in the former Edinburgh Royal Infirmary up in Lauriston Place, a building which I happened to drive past yesterday. It's really looking pretty magnificent, Chris. And we're going to do great things with that historic building, which used to be the main infirmary in the city of Edinburgh. Anyway, the Edinburgh Futures Institute sees as part of its mission to use this convening power to build on the legacy of Erickson and to convene some discussions on important topical issues, in this case not the Cold War, but all sorts of other important issues, including tonight's. So the idea is that we bring together experts, influencers, grassroots community leaders, our students and our staff, of course, and the wider public from across the world to try and analyze and understand issues, but importantly, to create momentum for change. So we have a university strategy called Strategy 2030, which is linked in many ways to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we see those as yardsticks of our achievement, and we're especially proud of our student community and recognize their voices in debates as future leaders here at this stage of their lives. So again, today, as we've done in the previous iterations of these conversations, we will work towards a declaration of principles, which we'll publish after the event, so there will be an output. Today is a collective global day, and Anthony and I were just discussing the use of the word global, but we hope this is a truly global event, certainly a truly global issue that we're discussing, and to try and think about the scientific and public policy issues and the places where universities like the University of Edinburgh can make a difference. I just want to say a few quick thank yous. There have been many people involved in the organisation of the series, and in particular, I'd like to extend my continued thanks to the Belan Cooper Family Foundation and the Belan Cooper family for their generous support of the Edinburgh Futures Conversations. This is the latest, as I said, in a series of events, and we hope that they become part of the regular fixture on the world stage for debating important events. It's been fantastic to see how these have been brought together in the previous iterations. Tonight we have a stellar panel of speakers who I'm not going to introduce, but I'm going to pass over now to Hermione Cockburn, who is, as well as a double alumnus of the University of Edinburgh. Is it only two, or have you got three? It's only two. Only 2. Still time, Hermione. You can do more degrees. But Hermione is currently the scientific director at Dynamic Earth, which many of you know is just down the street from here, a fabulous facility here in the city. She's also a well-known television and radio presenter presenting in scientific and educational programs. She's going to chair the event and introduce the speakers, and then there will be some speakers here and some speakers online. Then there'll be some closing remarks from Chris Speed, and in between those two, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers from the audience. So you're very welcome to the University of Edinburgh. You're very welcome to the Playfair Library. I hope that this will be an informative and educational evening, and also one that will lead to actions, because that's important to us. So with that, Hermione.
Would you like to come up and join me on the stage? Thank you. Liz, Anthony, that's lovely. Well, thank you so much, Peter, for that wonderful introduction and contextualizing of what we're all here to do and why we are here. Very warm welcome, just to add my word of welcome to you, everyone who's joined us here in the fabulous Playfair Library, and to everyone joining us online. It's my absolute privilege to have been invited to chair this session. As Peter said, we have a completely outstanding panel, some of whom you see here, some of whom are joining us online. And that's really the reason I wanted to be here, not because I know huge amounts about this subject. Actually, I just wanted to get to ask the questions to this amazing panel. It really is a privilege. I'm sorry, though, to say that we are one down on our advertised panel. Adrienne Buller is unfortunately not very well today and won't be joining us. So we wish Adrienne a speedy recovery if she's tuning in. If you were particularly interested in what Adrienne was going to be bringing to the conversation, she has published recently not 1 but 2 books, the first of which was called The Value of a Whale, and that's looking at green capitalism, and the second one, Owning the Future, which is a co-authored book, but they've both come out extremely recently, so do look them up if you're interested in what Adrienne was going to be talking about. So the format, Peter alluded to this, it's an uncomplicated format. We're going to be in discussion for, well, 50 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, and I will do my best to ensure that we are reflecting questions coming from the floor here, as well as questions coming in online on the iPad here. And we will be wrapping up at about 7:30. So, as you heard there, my background is in geography and environmental science. And I'm sort of coming to this event as your chair, experiencing a few mixed emotions, which may or may not reflect some of the emotions that you have when we think about the topic we're about to discuss. Do you know, the first one is actually relief. I'm really glad that as the environmental scientist on the stage, I don't have to show you a graph of carbon dioxide concentrations over the last 800,000 years. You know, we've kind of done that in a way, I hope particularly with those of you joining us in the room today. You know, the science is overwhelmingly clear. That's not to say that science education is not important. I would be doing a disservice to my whole career. But the fact is, we don't need to go over the science again every time we mention climate change. The second emotion that I'm experiencing really is optimism. Looking over the targets and the pledges and the national NDCs, where countries are stating what they're going to do in terms of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, you know, we have actually come some way. Things are really improving. That's not to say that the 1.5 degrees C elevation in mean temperature across the world is assured. Far, far from it. We need to work incredibly hard to achieve that goal. But at the end of COP26, 1.5 was still alive, even if it was on life support. The progress is being made, and with sustained action, I'm actually convinced that mitigating climate change, we are going to make some major steps forward in the next decade. So if those two are kind of positive emotions, they are really tempered by a feeling of actually devastation and regret. And that is that we are seeing the impacts of climate change realized across the globe, just as we knew was coming, but perhaps to actually see it broadcast into our living rooms, the increased droughts, the increased extreme weather, flooding. We are seeing that manifesting itself. We have not done well enough on mitigation and adaptation. The effects of climate change are being felt. And in the context of this discussion, and overwhelmingly in all conversations about climate change now, what we are seeing is that those who are being affected, those who are experiencing it and bearing the brunt of these impacts are, of course, those countries, those communities who have done the least to cause them. That is at the heart of climate justice, and that's what we will be discussing today. So that's quite enough for me at the moment. The kind of questions we're going to be exploring, just so you're aware of what's coming up, we're going to be talking about what climate justice means, what we can do, what we should do. We're going to be talking about COP27, what would success look like at COP27? These are the kind of things I'm going to hand over a moment and ask our panel to talk about. Just before I do, you heard there about the Edinburgh Futures Institute. I'm told that perhaps Chris might be worried about this, but things are looking good for next year to actually potentially be welcoming students onto MSc programs that are in development. And these are very relevant to themes linked to climate justice. In development are MScs on planetary health, sustainable lands and cities, the circular economy, and AI and data ethics. So if you are interested in delving into those topics in more depth, particularly after tonight's session, then do keep an eye on that. And Chris is around at the end, perhaps to reinforce that message. So, without further ado then, let me introduce our absolutely stellar panel for tonight's conversation. On stage with me, you can see, first of all, we have Liz, Dr. Elizabeth Cripps. Liz is a moral philosopher, and she focuses on climate ethics and justice. And Liz is senior lecturer in political theory at the University of Edinburgh. Welcome, Liz. Your most recent book, Liz has written extensively, but your most recent book is entitled What Climate Justice Means and Why Should We Care? That's recently been published by Bloomsbury. Absolutely fantastic. Hold that thought. That is my opening question. Next to Liz, we have AC Grayling. Professor Grayling, Anthony, is the founder and principal of New College of the Humanities at Northeastern University and its Professor of Philosophy. He is also a supernumerary fellow at St Anne's College, Oxford. I'm sure you know AC Grayling from his writing. His most recent book is called For the Good of the World. It's an excellent book, and that covers themes of climate change and climate justice, and that's recently been published also. Now let me turn online. Thank you so much for waiting patiently. Online, we are joined by Tasneem Essop. Tasneem is coming to us from Cape Town. And Tasneem is currently the Executive Director of Climate Action Network International. She completed a second term as Commissioner in the National Planning Commission in South Africa and leads the work on climate change and the just transition. And Tasneem, I was talking to her earlier, she's going to be at COP27 just in a few weeks' time, and we're definitely going to be picking up on that theme. Welcome, Tasneem. And finally, last but absolutely not least, I'm delighted to say that we have Dr. Arunabha Ghosh joining us from Vietnam, no less. Now, Arunabha is normally based in India, but he is an international policy expert. He's an author, he's a columnist, and he's an institution builder. He is the founder CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and that is consistently ranked as one of Asia's leading policy research institutions and amongst the world's best think tanks. So he's used to traveling, and he is coming to us from Vietnam, where I believe it's after midnight already. So thank you very much, Arunabha. Now, we do have another contributor to tonight's event. Baroness Scotland, Patricia Scotland, would love to have been here, and I would have loved to have had her on the stage as part of this panel, but she has sent a pre-recorded contribution which we will play once we get into the contribution. So I'll tell you a bit about Patricia Scotland when that happens. That is all my preamble, so now let's get the conversation started. Liz, as promised, I said I would come to you first and use the title of your new book. What does climate justice actually mean, and why should we care?
Thank you, Hermione. So I want to start with the second half of your question, why we should care, because actually I don't think this is controversial. So it's become this hugely politically polarized debate, and when I say become, I mean actually deliberately being manipulated into a matter of party politics. But this shouldn't be morally controversial because it's actually just about basic morality. So if we think about the heat waves that India and Pakistan were facing earlier this year, there was a gentleman quoted in The Guardian living in Pakistan who had been living, in his community, had been living with temperatures of nearly 50 degrees C, and he said, "We are living in hell." Somalia, Ethiopia have not for the last 3 years had the annual rainfalls that they would expect. The conditions there as a result are what I would have liked to describe as unimaginable, but they're not unimaginable because they are happening. Even in a relatively privileged country like this one, in the UK, heat waves are expected to increase by 250% by the middle of this century. So climate justice is about recognizing that this should not be happening. It is about people being able to lead decent rather than terrible lives, and that doesn't seem like a particularly controversial thing to say. If whatever your political affiliation, I think very few people would deny that it's wrong to kill somebody. Most people would accept that we should protect rather than violate basic human rights. And whatever we think a just society should look like in all the kind of complexity and detail that those debates get into, I think we can say again uncontroversially, well, basic justice says that we design our institutions, we develop our societies so that they are protecting rather than violating human rights, so that they're not killing people, basically. But if we think about something like climate change, caused by some people and destroying the lives of many, many other people, then we clearly have a fundamental injustice. So we should care. So we put it another way, if we care about our fellow humans, we should care about this. But of course, it's also more complicated than this, because this is something that you alluded to in your introduction. These harms aren't happening at random. So the 10% of the richest people in the world cause more than half of the greenhouse gas emissions. The top 20 oil and gas and coal companies are responsible for more than a third of greenhouse gas emissions. And those aren't the people who are suffering the harms. So these harms will fall on future generations, which it's worth remembering include our own children and grandchildren, and they will fall among future generations and already do fall disproportionately on those who are already marginalised. So at the global level, climate change is much worse for the global south. So for small island states, this is a matter of survival. Climate change within societies tends to be worse for women. It also tends to be worse for communities who have already been marginalised. So it tends to be worse for indigenous communities, for communities of colour, for black communities. And that's not happening by coincidence. That's happening because essentially these extreme weather events, which are made more frequent by climate change, are happening, and they are having a more harmful impact. They are much worse for those communities who are already vulnerable. And the reason they're already vulnerable is because of a pattern of historical injustices, or perhaps we should say more bluntly, atrocities, that have led to a number of communities essentially being systematically disadvantaged and to being excluded from the decision-making that takes place. So climate justice is essentially, I think, about saying, well, we need to prevent these harms. It's a moral imperative. That means mitigation. It means adaptation. It also means compensation for what's often called loss and damage, and I know we'll be talking about that more. And it also means that this is paid for in a fair way. So when it's decided internationally how these costs are going to be borne, that needs to take into account things like who are the polluters, who has benefited from past emissions, but also from the other patterns of historical injustice that have led to this situation. It means taking into consideration who can afford to bear these costs without themselves being made severely badly off. And it also is about what we call participatory justice. So we won't have climate justice unless everybody who is impacted by the global decision-making or state decision-making on this actually has a seat at the decision-making table. And in particular, that means that those communities who have been historically disadvantaged, who have been historically excluded from decision-making, actually get given a place in the decision-making rooms. They actually get a say in these decisions which impact them perhaps more than anybody else. And I think that is a key message to be thinking about when we come into the next COP.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Liz. That's a really great introduction, picking up on all these things, the intersectional issues of gender and race. We've got exclusion from decision-making and how do we overcome that. Thank you for introducing loss and damage. That's something that we'll definitely be picking up on. And all about responsibility as well. So a really wonderful overview and introduction there. Anthony, I'm going to come to you next. And the moral imperative is so strong, but we're all human, you know, and we live our complicated lives. How much does the issue of climate justice and doing anything about it really challenge our ability, even at a national level, let alone an international level, to come together and actually do anything about it?
Well, it's an invitation to be a bit better than human, to be a bit superhuman about this, I think, because, you know, as Liz has extremely eloquently explained there, the big problem that faces us now is no longer having to combat the deniers. As you pointed out, that argument has been won, but the argument that hasn't been won yet is with the people who are dragging their feet. Governments and multinationals around the world are not merely dragging their feet, they're actually doing things which are very unhelpful, like wanting to frack, wanting to extract more fossil fuels and so on in response to the energy crisis that we have now. And part of the reason, and it's a big part of the reason why they are dragging their feet, is precisely because now that the conversation has moved on to questions of justice from questions of science, we now see that the people who are going to be worst affected, so these are the people in the global south indeed, the ones who historically have been disadvantaged and put into this more vulnerable position by what's happened in the past, they have a very, very legitimate claim, at very least, to be treated equitably when it comes to bearing the burdens and the costs of dealing with the problem. And that is something which, of course, a lot of governments, and especially the ones in the rich north, are not too happy to concede to. So this is another difficulty. This is an obstacle in the way of a very, very necessary conversation, because if you're going to really get on with addressing the problems, you know, you pointed out that the 1.5 is on life support. Well, it's on, you know, it's in the ICU in a pretty desperate condition, and we're in a position of emergency now, and even the project of mitigating and adapting for some of the worst things that are inevitable, that are going to happen this century, with displacements of very, very large populations from littorals and so on, even in the face of that, the need to get the international community, who's only an international endeavor that can address this, really to come to some working conclusion about how they're going to help the people and involve the people who are the ones who are going to be directly impacted. And that is something that is proving at the moment to be a bit of a balk, because they don't want to accept the responsibility. And we need to get into the weeds of this, of the conversation, not necessarily now, but as a global community, in order to separate out all the different things that have to be done in order to deal with those problems. Not just reparations, but also investment in alternative energy sources. I mean, because here is the thing. In the last 30 or so years, we have lifted an enormous number of people out of poverty. And when you lift people out of poverty, naturally they consume more, and that means that there's more production. So consumption and production, it's not a question of reducing them, it's a question of making them sustainable, of moving to sustainable practices. And to do that, there has to be major investment, a major shift of emphasis, involving people in those parts of the world. And by the way, traditional communities and these most vulnerable communities, between them, look after 80% of the most diverse, species-diverse parts of the world. So, I mean, there's a ramification of complexities here, where we need to see what the challenges are and to really do something about involving them and making it possible for them. And this is even before we think about reparations for past injuries. It's about how we address the problem now.
Thank you so much. I'm so itching to pick up on some themes there, but I'm going to bring in our panellists online to hear from them before we get the conversation going. Tasneem, I hope you could hear Liz and Anthony's introductory comments there. I wanted to pick up on how high up you feel, given your experience, that climate justice sort of is. Are we seeing it coming up the international sort of discussion agenda? And what do you see from your perspective in South Africa as the main barriers to effective solutions? Hopefully we'll be able to.
Thank you very much, Liz, and greetings to everybody. So Liz, before I actually answer your specific questions, I really do want to touch on this issue of defining climate justice and building off what Liz and Anthony has just said, actually take it to a much clearer point. You know, climate injustice is structural, it's systemic, and it comes off the back of systems that we've been through, including colonialism, including slavery, industrialization, the resource extraction of the global South. And there is a huge debt that is being owed because of those systems and the historical emissions and responsibilities that comes with that. And it's not, I don't want us to leave the idea that this is a kind of moral issue. It really is about justice. And so I would really want to get into the deeper understanding of climate justice in a way that locates it very much within its structural and systemic context. But for now, I do want to, I've been asked about the COP, for example, and whether this is rising up in the kind of political agenda, especially in the multilateral process. And I do want to make one observation so that we're very clear about the COPs and the UNFCCC. The COPs and UNFCCC is not the front line where the battle to achieve climate justice is going to be won or lost, potentially lost. But certainly that's not the front line. It is, however, a really important multilateral space. It's the only multilateral space that we have to address the global climate crisis. And certainly it is within that space that there are mechanisms and interventions that can allow for the advancing of climate justice. So to be clear, we're not going to achieve climate justice through the UNFCCC, but the UNFCCC can allow for the opportunities to advance of key fronts to achieve climate, to set us on a path to climate justice. And so let me say that, of course, the kind of concept of climate justice across the board has become more, like many of these concepts, have become more spoken about, more used, and as a hard reminder to all of us. In fact, when the Paris Agreement was finalized, you will see reference to the term or the concept climate justice only in the preamble, and in fact it is very particularly noted that it notes the importance for some of the concept of climate justice. That's really important. At the time of the Paris Agreement finalization, it was not a concept that was accepted across the board. It's very clearly defined. It was a concept for some, not for everybody. And so since the time of Paris, of course, we've seen an increasing awareness and, the conversations on climate justice increasing, but does that translate into a political agenda? And I would argue no, for the following reasons. And I'm not as optimistic as you are, Hermione, about the outcomes of COP26, in fact. Okay. It was at that COP where we really pushed on the issue of climate finance to address loss and damage. In fact, civil society, in the broadest way, made this a huge issue. We made it a litmus test. In fact, the G77 plus China, the negotiating bloc on behalf of the Global South, put on the table a proposal for establishing a finance facility. And let me be very clear about this. That finance for loss and damage is, in fact, a way of addressing climate justice. Whether you use words like compensation and reparation, in the end, you need that finance to achieve climate justice for those who are least responsible for this crisis. And it was those who are most responsible for the climate crisis that, in fact, blocked that decision. Now, this is the limitation of the UNFCCC, because it is power that matters. And it is consistently those who are responsible for the climate crisis that, in fact, will shy away from their responsibilities and obligations. What are they? To lead in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, to provide the climate finance that would allow developing countries to do their own mitigation, but very importantly, to adapt, and now more and more to address losses and damages due to the climate impacts. So certainly on all those fronts, rich nations have not fulfilled their obligations to achieve climate justice. They've not provided the finance, in fact, apologized for it, for not delivering a commitment that they'd made. They apologized for that in Glasgow. On adaptation, they put up, committed to a doubling finance, but none of the money has materialized. And in loss and damage, they just will not accept that, they have responsibilities towards that. Just what we can say, however, to pivot towards COP27, at least there's some light at the, well, not at the end of the tunnel for COP27, and it's really minor. Finally, the rich nations did not block loss and damage finance to be on the formal agenda. We had to fight for that, actually. And now the outcome is that it will be on the formal agenda, which means at least we can have the conversation, which means hopefully we can have an outcome on addressing funds and funding for loss and damage at COP27. I want to say, sorry.
Carry on. I mean, I hope that this is a fantastic summary of what has been happening. And I'm glad you've mentioned how hard you have had to fight to even get climate justice on the agenda. When I read it was on a provisional agenda, do you think it will actually feature on the agenda properly now at COP27?
Yeah, no, that's what I'm telling you, that we've now just received the news. It's hot off the press. That they are not going to block this at the, it's on the formal agenda.
Well, small steps. Would you like to make a final point?
Steps.
Yes, would you like to make a final point before I bring in Arunabha?
Yes, I want to make this point by way of example. So yes, climate impacts are hitting us across the world. It's very important to point out another, of course, injustice. That impact is differentiated. And we've seen Hurricane Ian, for example, hitting Florida. In Florida itself, you would have differentiated experiences of that impact. Those who are less resourced, etc., marginalized, would have a different impact felt. But now I want to say something to you. President Biden went, and rightly so, spoke about the recovery. They've put in all the resources to deal with recovery in Florida. And he announces that they, as a government, will be able to spend 2 tranches of money to support people affected. Let's round it off. $38,000 for home repairs. In addition, $38,000 for loss of personal property. Now let's think about Florida, and then let's think about Pakistan. I just want to say this to you. And then we talk about who's responsible for the crisis, who's least responsible for the crisis, and whether or not the resources, the reparation, and the justice is being achieved right now. And I would argue, absolutely not.
No. That's a fantastic. Thank you so much, Tasneem. I hope you can pick up on the feeling within this room, the passion that is there supporting your statements, and really that example of what happens in Florida when a hurricane hits, and what happens in Pakistan when floods devastate livelihoods is a fantastic example of what is happening and what is at the root of this discussion. Arunabha, I'd like to bring you in, on the back of those three introductory sort of statements. What's your experience of this topic and through your work in international global policy work?
Well, first of all, Hermione and the Edinburgh Futures Institute, thank you so much for having me. Namaste from India, and since I'm in Vietnam right now, Xin Chao. For me, I use simple rules of thumb. Justice delayed is justice denied.
Oops. That is a frustration.
Loss and damage of some form of conversation of the agenda. I'm sorry?
Arunabha, we're just getting a little bit of disruption on your live feed. Would you like to just start that? We heard you saying justice delayed is justice denied, and then we lost you. Could you repeat, please?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm getting a bit of a feedback, but that's all right. It's Houston calling Apollo.
We're hearing you quite clearly. It's just cutting in. But if you just keep talking for a minute, we'll just see how it goes.
Okay, we'll give it our best shot. So I was saying that, for me, justice delayed is justice denied. The issue of loss and damage has been on the agenda in some form or the other since 2007. As the name just mentioned, it was only last year that there was another promise of trying to think of what could be the compensation or finance, let's forget the word compensation associated with it, but again, a few years down the line. The point is, if you're a farmer, as you, I think as Liz was describing, if you're a farmer who's experienced 3 years of failing rains, then 15 years of negotiations that promises further negotiations is really a moot point. So we can sit in in the negotiation chambers and congratulate ourselves about managing to put in 2 words into the agenda, but we know that that really does not translate into anything on the ground. Now, this is happening, and I think as Anthony mentioned, this is not happening by accident. This is happening in a very deliberate way, because you delay the justice precisely because you don't want to take on the responsibility of what your actions have undone for many other people, let alone how you then atone for that responsibility. The point is, we're not even taking responsibility. So how do you game this story? I see different games at play here. Number one is a game between doubt and certainty. So for many years, and Hermione, you started by saying you're feeling good about the fact that we've somewhat won the science game. For a long time, we did not win the science game because we kept doubting whether the science was sufficient enough, clear enough, credible enough, probabilistic enough to make a decision. So that helped us to delay justice for a while. Now, actually, when we have the certainty or near certainty, that itself has become another game. Because the world has to get to net zero by 2050, it has been couched as if everybody has to get to net zero by 2050, completely denying that no race is won by everybody at the same moment. So the certainty at a global level has been used to hide the responsibility of some that is greater than others. Another game that is at play is finance versus investment. So we keep hearing about climate finance, and as Tasneem rightly said, that is not delivered. But we seldom hear about climate investment. Now, what is climate investment? It is again what Anthony was referring to, not just the past, but also the future. The reason I'm here in Vietnam is because in the entire Southeast Asian region, it has the largest deployment of renewable energy capacity. I come from India, where we have already the third or the fourth largest renewables market in the world. Now, India gets still just 2% of renewables investment. Emerging markets in other parts of the world get even less. Now, I studied as an economist. I was told capital flows from capital-rich regions to capital-poor regions, and labor goes in the other direction. Now, I should go back to university and demand my fees back, because that's not how the world is operating. So we play this game about pledges on climate finance, but never about deployment of climate investment. The third game that is played is technology versus mercantilism. So again, we talk about clean technology as if it has no values attached to it. And we celebrate that a clean technology has been innovated somewhere. And yet, if you actually look at it, the global South continues to be the provider of the raw materials that go into clean technology. The global South is not permitted to add value to those raw materials. Everybody now wants to be an exporter of clean technology. Nobody wants to be an importer. Nobody wants to create global supply chains for clean technology to be diffused, not just deployed, but to be diffused, and that value to be associated and linked and deployed in the global South. So clean technology on one hand, and yet industrial policy and mercantilism continues. And the fourth game is production versus consumption. Yes, of course, we've got an SDG that puts production and consumption together. But actually, the whole narrative about climate discourse is about production. So you shift all your factories to China, you shift all your factories to Vietnam, you shift all your factories to India, and say China, Vietnam, India are polluting. But you raise the question about lifestyles and consumption. No, that's not on the agenda. So justice delayed is justice denied. But it's remarkable that we talk about that, but we don't see through these four games that are at play to structurally prevent us from receiving justice.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely fantastic, if incredibly alarming, actually. Now, we do have, as I say, a fifth member of the panel, and we're going to come back and pick up on themes that we've talked about. But before we do, let me introduce our fifth member of the panel. It is the Right Honourable Patricia Scotland QC. Now, Patricia really wanted to be with us. She couldn't. She sent us a pre-recorded clip. Just to remind you, Patricia took office as Secretary General of the Commonwealth in April 2016, and that serves 54 governments and 2.4 billion people. And she's going to be speaking, as you will hear, about that, the perspective that brings. She's a lawyer by profession. She became the first Black and youngest woman ever to be appointed Queen's Counsel, and she was appointed to the House of Lords as Baroness Scotland back in 1997. So if we could play in Patricia Scotland's clip now, that would be wonderful.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, thank you for inviting me to be part of this fantastic and important conversation. I wish I could be with you in person, but I am grateful that you have enabled me to join you virtually. The Commonwealth today stands taller than ever. We are 2.5 billion people in 56 countries, spread across 5 continents and 6 basins of our one shared ocean. 33 of our members are small states, of which 25 are small island developing states. Enshrined in our charter and in the priorities of Commonwealth leaders, the Commonwealth is the foremost global champion of small and vulnerable states, and there is no issue in which the needs and priorities of small and vulnerable states are more apparent than climate justice. I have said many times, in many places, that climate change is not only an existential threat in itself, it is a threat multiplier. it amplifies existing social, political and economic inequalities and brings forward the tipping point for conflict. Its impacts are felt by the most vulnerable, the very people who did not cause the problem. I believe that the global climate dialogue is waking up to the reality of those who experience climate injustice most profoundly. Whether on climate finance, on loss and damage, on adaptation or on mitigation. At COP26, you could feel the presence of small and vulnerable states. It is vital that we take this forward into COP27. More than ever, the experience and perspectives of small and vulnerable communities is the barometer of whether the outcomes of global climate talks have been successful. This is an important shift in establishing true climate justice. I was so keen to be with you today because universities have a vital role to play in the urgent need to deliver just, fair, and equitable climate action. To illustrate this, I will focus on our experience of one aspect of climate change impacts: food. It is no secret that the world faces a food crisis. At the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Kigali in June, leaders made tackling the food crisis, both short-term and long-term, a central priority. As part of this, leaders ratified our groundbreaking Living Lands Charter. The Charter recognises that the vulnerabilities of our ecosystems to land degradation, biodiversity loss, and climate change are closely interrelated and need to be considered collectively. The Charter is principled, member-led, action-oriented, and it relies on expertise. We are working with our friends in the Commonwealth of Learning and the Association of Commonwealth Universities to maximise our access to their expertise. The ACU has proposed a Living Lands Charter Fellowship Scheme to strengthen the conduits between policymakers and expertise. The Leap for Food and Nutrition Security and Sustainable Agriculture has provided new platforms for experts, policymakers and delivery specialists to collaborate. And their high-level policy dialogue is a real opportunity to increase synergy and coherence. But the key to success is not only the willingness for academics, policymakers, international organisations and governments to work together, it is in the way we work together. We need to recognise that, whether in policy, research or programmes, the world has been too narrow, too siloed in its approach to climate action. The idea that in policy or programmes, climate change is distinct from, say, peace building is outdated. And the idea that in academia, the climatologists should be hermetically sealed from the oceanologists and the experts on agriculture, energy, water, or humanitarian response is old news. In fact, it can be dangerous. The scale and complexity of the challenges we face demands that we reach beyond our traditional disciplines and work together in a multidisciplinary approach. In our Living Lands agenda, to truly thrive, in fact, in any area of climate action, we need you to crunch the data, to generate new ideas, to work with us, to support us, to challenge us, to enrich us with your knowledge, and in doing so, to make the world safer. I know that you will engage in the conversations before you with energy and optimism, and have no doubt that your imaginations and your work will be enriched by the chance to talk to and learn from one another. This is so important because we need your acuity, your creativity, your commitment, and your willingness to work together more than ever. There is no time to waste. And so I thank you.
Wonderful, yeah. Thank you so much to Patricia there. A real call to arms, I think, for interdisciplinary working, which I know the Edinburgh Futures Institute is really all about. And it's very exciting that we will have that new opportunity to look into these this topic. So moving the conversation on then and bringing it round back to you, Liz and Anthony, we are well into this era of loss and damage. We've heard a lot about responsibility, reluctance to take on financing. This goes back to our sort of moral responsibilities as the causes. And I say us, you know, I mean, us means different things in different situations, but I'm talking about the global north, in effect, those responsible for the problems here. How can we change people, change organisations to make them feel that responsibility and enact on it?
Well, you know, look, Liz said very well that one big problem is we've got to get the people who are most affected to be real participants. And we see that actually it is activists, it's activist organisations who are really making the running on getting the justice issue onto the agenda. Baroness Scotland is absolutely right that there has to be a concerted effort by all the different spheres of expertise that can be brought to bear on this across the whole range. But the real key is to get those people who are most to blame, but also most capable of getting a solution off the ground. And that's governments and multinationals. Now, I don't want to just point the finger and blame and they're all evil and they're doing it because they want to be nasty to the rest of us. They're not. It's because the whole system has baked into it things that make it very, very difficult for them to do this. Short-termism in the political cycle. The fact that you have to please your electors, stay in power, get re-elected again, means that you don't want to get competitive disadvantages for your economy and reductions in GDP and so on. So the short-termism of the political cycle is a big problem. Multinationals, any kind of corporation, any productive industries have got stakeholders and shareholders, and they've got bottom lines, and it's very difficult for them to turn around. So to get them to see that they've got to think differently and to start, growing that longer arms and deeper pockets and really contributing something to the investment in saving the future, involves a huge turnaround for them. And how difficult it is, because this baking in point reaches so far down. I want to give you one example of the great problem here. A few years ago, I met and talked to the late Arjen Hoekstra, who was a wonderful contributor to debate about water in our world. And he asked me a question which threw me when he first asked it. He said, how much of the fresh water consumed in the United Kingdom is imported? And I was very surprised by that question. I was thinking of bottles of Evian and so on. And he said, the answer is 70%. 70% of the fresh water consumed in the United Kingdom is imported in the form of fresh fruit and vegetables grown in countries with a water problem, and they are flown here overnight to be fresh in the supermarket the next morning. I mean, 3 levels of insanity there. The fact that we're importing water from water-stressed countries and we're flying them in. And this is something about our system and the way we live and what we expect when we walk into a supermarket. And it's so plugged into the whole system, the way the system works, that you try and turn it round. But it's like trying to turn around an oil tanker at sea. It just takes so much effort and so much time. And the people who we need to alert to this urgency are precisely the people who are themselves locked into these short-term cycles. Yeah. So that's our problem.
Yeah. I mean, it is a real problem, isn't it, Liz? And what can we do? If there was one thing that you might want to champion, I mean, is it down to us individuals working collectively? Can that achieve the kind of things we need? Is that our moral responsibility?
I mean, I think if citizens working collectively can't achieve this, then nothing will, because governments and corporations aren't going to change on their own. So I hope so, is definitely the answer. I mean, I think one sort of clear-cut thing, morally speaking, well, two. One is that there is a somewhat ludicrous situation where nominally there are countries who owe financial debts to the global north, when in fact the global north owes them a much bigger climate or ecological debt. So from a moral point of view, changing that would be a clear start. Not subsidising fossil fuels would be another pretty obvious start. So in point of view of what I would like to see. But I think to pick up on a point that Anthony made, it's also psychological. It's about short-termism in the political cycle, in the way that, and also I guess in not just short-termism, but localism, or at least statism, in that the way our democracies function, we vote within our own states. But if somebody's voting in a country like the US or the UK, they're actually voting on things which will have a huge impact on those living in other parts of the world. And so there's this kind of mismatch between what our democracies can provide and genuine participatory justice, which would need to be global and intergenerational. And there have been some very sort of interesting suggestions in terms of global citizens' assemblies, which might be potential ways forward. And there's also a need, I think, for a widespread shift psychologically, because we individually are wired towards thinking short term now, and so if we can kind of think in a deeper long-term way and develop strategies to think in terms of the much longer future generations, or even, to be honest, starting to think seriously in terms of the lifespan of our children and grandchildren, would be a start.
And I know that's something that you have written about, this responsibility to future generations. It's not just about the immediate population. Tasneem, you said that the UNFCCC, i.e., COP27, it's not the area where climate justice should be decided, but it's kind of the best we've got in terms of facilitating global cooperation for this. Are the right people being listened to there? And if not, what is the alternative way that we can progress on this issue outside of that framework?
Yeah, let me just correct something. I'm saying it is not the place where we will achieve climate justice, but it is one of the important spaces in which to advance climate justice. And so certainly for COP27, the priorities to advance climate justice would, of course, be related to the delivery of climate finance, especially the finance that was pledged and committed, and move away from the kind of apology, we'll do this in 2 years' time approach. And secondly, now that it's on the agenda, let's take this further at COP27 and actually see an agreement being reached to establish a fund, a finance facility, whatever we call it, but to set up the kind of mechanism so that finance can flow at very scaled up levels to address loss and damage. And the final area that we would need to see as a strong outcome is, in fact, on adaptation finance, and those who made pledges to give adaptation finance, and those who said they committed to doubling adaptation finance should literally actually deliver on these things. This is meant to be an implementation COP. And that's what we would like to see, implementation on all of the issues that can advance climate justice and that actually matter to vulnerable communities and peoples across the world. And this is our hope. Of course, this has been framed as an African COP. These are the key African priorities. The COP27 Egyptian presidency has identified these issues as priorities as well. And we have to recognize that actually going into this COP27 has its own contradictions that we have to deal with. On the one hand, you know, the concept of climate justice is even being used by the COP presidency, and we know what the domestic situation is in that country. So there's a big contradiction. And we have also recently read about the sponsorship of Coca-Cola, you know, for this COP as well. So it does have the contradictions that I said. This is not really where we will fight the final battle on achieving climate justice. We're working in a limited space, but an important space. And as civil society, we will certainly be pushing as best we can to get the key priorities to advance climate justice sorted out at COP27.
That is, I'm conscious of the time. So what I wanted to pick up on there, we heard that, you know, COP27, it's the implementation COP, and that's terribly important. It's the finance COP. It's also the biodiversity COP. And I wanted to just introduce our responsibilities to non-human species as one part of that. But also, actually, the climate crisis is a planetary crisis. It's all about biodiversity as well. And Arunabha, I was wondering how much that comes into your work. You know, I have a bit of a problem. Sometimes I'm using climate and planetary crisis sort of almost interchangeably. How much is biodiversity sort of part of the conversation implicitly or explicitly?
Well, it is part of the conversation and it is not part of the conversation. If you, again, I mean, I talked about doubt versus certainty. If you look at a lot of the modeling, many of the models look at net zero, where the netting out of the emissions depends on significant land use change, which is basically you're using bioenergy and carbon capture and storage without actually accounting for how much space that's going to take up, what it'll do for food production, what it'll do for communities on the ground, what it'll do for biodiversity, as opposed to just emissions abatement or emissions or carbon removal from the atmosphere. So it's a very technocentric approach towards just one equation, which is the carbon equation, whereas there are many other dimensions, such as Anthony mentioned, water. At the same time, it is equally not addressed in the sense that when we think about of the climate crisis, we don't think about what it is doing to terrestrial land species, what it is doing to life underwater, what it is doing to our interactions with those other species. So there is a problem here. And the problem is that for 30 years, since the Rio Conventions were initiated in 1992, we have treated one of those conventions as the primary convention, and the other two, the one on land degradation and the other on biodiversity, as the sort of stepchildren of the Rio process. It's time to bring them together to try and understand what those linkages are, and then look at what is that pathway towards sustainable development that we've really ignored in these conversations. See, ultimately, we are not only solving for a carbon equation, we're solving for a trust equation. And the trust equation is weighted in favor of communities. It's weighted in favor of biodiversity. It's weighted in favor of 5.5 billion people who live in the global south. Now, if you don't weight it in that way, you are structurally, again, creating an inequity, even in the solutions that we are contemplating and offering.
What I hear there is, you know, I'm desperately trying to be optimistic. I mean, it is quite a devastating period of time to be alive in. Otherwise, you know, if we can get this right, from what you're saying, this has such a positive impact. You know, it could. How likely do you feel that progress can really be made in this critical time frame of the next 5 to 10 years? I'll just ask you, Arunabha, to come in on that and perhaps open that up.
I wouldn't be doing my job if I weren't optimistic, and I wouldn't look forward to 5 to 10 years. I would look back. In 2010, when India's national solar mission began, we had less than 20 megawatts of solar. We now have nearly 60,000 megawatts of solar, 175,000 megawatts of non-fossil capacity. It'll be the first major economy that would build out more renewables than its entire electricity system. The state in India that has the largest coal reserves 2 months ago came out with a solar plan, which is a 4,100% increase in solar capacity within 5 years, not even up to 2030. The point is, these stories from the global south don't appear in the media of the global north. You don't get to hear that 63% of emerging markets have already peaked or plateaued in their use of fossil fuels, but not because investment flowed from the global north, it's because they put in their own resources. So if you want to accelerate climate action, follow the actions of the global south, rather than assume that the global south needs to follow the lack of leadership of the global north.
So that's wonderful, and presumably this thank you. And this event, hopefully we can feel, is one tiny part of that, drawing the voices together, communication. I mean, that is my bag, science communication. But in this respect, I do feel that whilst we may have largely failed in some ways to get the science communication story going quickly enough, we've touched on that. What now? We cannot fail again. We need to get communication going. We need people in this room to hear the stories that you've just talked about. Anthony, I want to pick up on something that you've written about. You know, communication. It is just got to be such a big part of what we do, isn't it?
Absolutely. The thing is that these kinds of conversations tend to be, you know, we're preaching to the choir and so on. So everybody here is completely sold on that. But there is a big problem, which is that because there has been a long drawn conversation, a big battle with the deniers and the distractors over the last several decades, and things have moved and things have changed on that front. And now we are beginning to identify these other incredibly important problems like achieving justice. But because of the length of the conversation, it's turned a lot of people off and glazed them over. And when they hear it mentioned, they hear the phrase climate change or the climate problem, they just don't want to know. And then they've heard from the deniers and the distractors some things which unfortunately are true, one of which is that if each individual person on the planet did everything they could do to be as green as possible, that's still not going to solve the problem. And the problem has to be scale. It's got to be at the large scale. It's got to be massive shift to renewables, a massive technological effort to try to do some capture and so on, but a big change of attitude and activity. And our problem that we were mentioning earlier about those with the vested interest. So the communication challenge is this. It's to get back all those people who glazed over and turned off and who don't want to hear any more about it and who don't want to be told that we're in a disaster, and to get them involved, because what we've heard tonight is this wonderful fact that the people who are making the difference are the citizen and activist groups. It's the people on the ground. It's the people who came up with the Bali principles a decade or so ago. It's the people who've been meeting in New York now, the indigenous tribes of the territories, who were talking about their custodianship of their ecologies and so on. It's these people who are beginning to make the difference and to crack through a little bit on this issue and raising the issue, which, I mean, you know, did the general public know there was a climate justice issue 5-10 years ago? I doubt it. So it's that bit of communication which is really necessary in order to get people back into the activist mode, that they have the responsibility ultimately, I think, and the potential for really changing the minds of governments and really making a difference with, for example, their purchasing power on corporations and multinationals. And it has to come from there. It is coming from there. I mean, all the best movement is coming from the activists and citizen groups at the moment. And in order to potentiate them and support them, that communication has to go to the people who have so far turned off.
Yeah, absolutely. Liz, would you like to add to that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I completely agree. This is a case where it's about individuals coming together and acting collectively, and that is the way that we should be thinking of what we need to do. I think something I wanted to flag up, which has sort of almost taken over from climate deniers is almost equally dangerous is the kind of rise of, if you like, the climate fatalists. So this sort of shift from it's not happening to it's happening and it's so terrible and we can't do anything about it now. And Mary Anise Hegler calls them doomer dudes. And I think that is almost as worrying in a way as the denialist narrative, because either way it results in people thinking, well, I can't make a difference, I'm not going to do anything. So communication really needs to focus on stressing that that's not the case. But there is, on the one hand, there are these incredible resources from groups who are already dealing with the reality of climate change, developing innovative ways to adapt to it, or Indigenous communities who have been living in much more harmonious ways with the non-human world for centuries. There are huge resources to learn from if people can genuinely be given a seat at the decision-making table. So if we have genuine participatory justice, there's a huge scope for a positive way forward. And I think the other thing to say, to sort of on the communication front, to counter this fatalist or doomerist narrative, is that actually when we talk about the kind of changes that we can make, the changes in consumption, the changes in lifestyle that we can make, they're pretty much all good for us as well anyway. I mean, there's that cartoon which says, oh, well, what if we change our diet, have active travel, have lots more engagement with nature and all these other things? And what if we've done it all for nothing because climate change is a hoax? Climate change is not a hoax, but even if it was, I mean, these are all things that it's going to be really positive to achieve anyway. And I think that's something that the communication really needs to be clear on.
Yes, absolutely. The benefits, the possibilities are absolutely wonderful to achieve. I'm pleased to say, just a little plug for Dynamic Earth, where I work, the science education work that we do, one of the latest workshops that we've added into our schools program is actually climate justice. You know, we have to use all ways that we can to reach all sorts of different audiences so that we are all invested and aware of the issue, but also the multiple benefits that can be achieved as we move forward. I'm just conscious of the time. We're going to move to questions now, but panelists, I'll try and come back to you at the end for just sort of final thoughts. The time has whizzed by. It's been absolutely incredible to hear from our panelists, but I will now hand it out to the audience to carry on initiating the conversation. I can see a few questions have come in here online, but please raise your hand in the room if you would like to ask a question. What we will do, classically, we will bring round a roving microphone. If you do raise your hand, I'll identify you. If I could ask you to wait for the microphone, to stand up, and then we can identify you, well, just we can see you properly and hear you properly. Was there a question here in the row 3? Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, so we know that, you know, there's a few big corporations and governments that are really contributing to climate change. And my question for the panel, anyone who wanted to pick this up, is to what extent do you think the governments are responsible for the companies that are domesticiled in their region, in their country?
Okay, that was a good question. Basically, it was like governments versus sort of large corporations, was that right? And whether the governments have responsibility for the large corporations that are, basically headquartered in their own countries. Is there anyone that would like to pick up on that?
To chip in to start off.
Thank you, Liz.
Yeah, I mean, I think governments do have responsibilities for what they allow to happen, for the legislation that they pass. I mean, it's complicated with international corporations because what individual country can be said to have responsibility for them. But I think two things can be said. One is that governments are certainly responsible for deciding to go on subsidising fossil fuels, which is what a lot of them are doing at the moment. And the other thing to say is that we, as consumers, and this is something that Anthony touched on before, we also have a responsibility. So as consumers, we have a responsibility collectively for the decisions we make, the corporations we buy from. And as shareholders, and many people don't think of themselves as shareholders, but anyone who has a pension fund is essentially a shareholder. We also have responsibilities in that way. So yes, I think governments do have responsibilities here, but I don't think there's a sort of clear-cut divide, sort of say, well, separate the government from all the individuals, because although the responsibility, and I do think the primary accountability here lies with the big corporations, with the governments, As individuals, I think we still have responsibilities or duties, to put it in a more forward-looking way, to try and use the power that we have to change that.
Okay, great. There's lots of questions online. Is there another question from the room, just while I'm sifting? Yes, there's a red jumper gone up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for everything that has been said. It was very interesting so far. My question is, so there's been this talk of us being a global community, of course, but do you envision, maybe this is naive, potentially in the future of moving more towards kind of local communities? You mentioned indigenous groups and what we can learn from them, but how does this shift from sort of global to local and reducing our reliance on kind of imports and exports and so on, decreasing consumption, how would that then tie in with sort of the political shifts that we're also seeing, like this rise of far-right nationalism, for instance, across Europe and so on? So yeah, sorry, I tangled my question, but I'm asking about like the shift from potentially global to local, and then the potential dangers of kind of nationalism along with that.
Okay. Is there anyone in particular you would like to answer your question? I think they've already self-identified. Arunabha, would you like to come in if you got that question? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I wouldn't subscribe to the idea that we should not be trading with each other. I think there should be actually more trade of goods, services, ideas, and people, so that we actually begin to understand our lived realities a little bit better. But I fully subscribe to your idea about localization. And what do I mean by that? I think the future is not just going to be decarbonized or needs to be decarbonized. The future is also going to be significantly decentralized. And I'm going to give two examples. Let's take agriculture. We think of industrial scale agriculture that needs to be decarbonized, and that is important. But the bulk of the world's farmers are small and marginal farmers, working on small plots of land, working often in arid and semi-arid areas, or working in areas that used to be abundant with water and now are water stressed, thanks to a changing climate. So how we bring in practices of sustainable agriculture is not just about how you transform industrial scale agriculture and our food habits. It's also how do you make the small farmer more resilient? How do you bring in agroforestry? How do you bring in soil conservation practices? How do you bring in multi-cropping on small plots of land, but which is not using intensive fertilizers and chemicals? The world's largest experiment on natural farming is underway in one state in India, with more than 800,000 farmers practicing it. And that movement is spreading. But it starts with the small plots of land. The other example is the future of power markets. Now, the power sector takes about 40% of global emissions. So we think we've got to go somewhere far out and fix a power plant. Of course, we got to do that. But the good thing about renewables is that the sun shines in many more places than where coal or oil or gas is found. And therefore, the future of power markets, even by economic efficiency, even by technological innovation, will be more decentralized, which means that the business models, that the community ownership, that the skills, that the jobs that are going to get created, 7 times more jobs get created with distributed solar than with large-scale solar. And solar itself creates more jobs per unit of energy than coal or gas. So the point I'm trying to make here is that whether you look at agriculture, whether you look at power, I could even get into industrial production and so forth, the future is going to be more decentralized, is going to be more localized, and that can contribute to the decarbonized future that we all desire, without necessarily limiting the trade and the exchange of ideas and understanding that we still need to create a global community of action.
Thank you so much. So many questions coming in online. I'm going to find, there's so many different directions we could go. One thing, I think this one has really stood out. I don't think I've heard anyone even mention disabled people yet. They are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, but they don't seem to have a voice. They are only demonized for being unable to make the same changes as everybody else. Well, I just wanted to ask from a moral perspective about, hearing all different voices, isn't that just so fundamental to this? And yeah, I apologise for not incorporating disabled people when we're thinking about gender, race, all the different groups that we want to hear from. How important is that?
Well, I mean, so yes, intersectionality is a key concept here. Yeah. And when we talk about marginalised groups, yes, it's about gender, it's about race, but it's also about being disabled, it's about LGBT communities. I mean, there are many different communities who are affected, and basically any marginalised community is likely to be impacted worse by these extreme events of climate change. And what the concept of intersectionality does is it says, well, actually, you need to understand how these harms will fall particularly on people who are in more than one disadvantaged group. So yes, disabled people are a key group there who have a lot at stake. And I think the other point about the criticism of disabled people for not being able to make these changes is a really important one as well, because there is a real danger in this sort of narrative, which again, I think this is another sort of shift in the way that big fossil fuel corporations have gone, is that they now try and make it all about individual choices and how basically this is down to you. But that's not going to be enough to solve it. It would be massively unfair, it would be inefficient, it would also, and the point Anthony made earlier, it would also actually be impossible to do it all by just changing our lifestyles. So the kind of narrative that can simultaneously try and push responsibility away from big corporations and try and put blame on one of the communities that is most vulnerable for not being able to make lifestyle choices is a really dangerous way of thinking about it, yeah.
Okay, another question coming in, which I can't really ignore because this is really relevant to us in this room. In keeping with the futures of the Edinburgh Futures Institute, what contribution does higher education need to make at a fundamental level like teaching and degrees in order to support longer term thinking and action? Anthony, you are a professor of philosophy, you've set up a new institution. Tell us your views on that.
Well, the great ambition for people who are involved in education generally, and certainly in higher education, is that you are going to encourage and enhance the potential of people who will be thoughtful and reflective, who will take on roles as thought leaders, as people in influential positions, who will go on into positions of responsibility, both in the public and in the private domains. And what you hope is, and of course it's a hope that is not always all that often enough borne out, but that they will carry with them the things that they've learned and the perspectives that they've been asked to consider while they were in education and apply them. That is the great hope. Now, the thing is that you know, of course, university is very important for things like partying and making friends and having a good time, getting a job and so on. And there are plenty of people who kind of forget really the content and some of the principles that they were very earnest about when they were students. But just so long as there are enough of them who will carry that forward and who will want to put it to work, and the more we in education stress that aspect of it, stress the responsibility that we have if we've had the opportunity and in many cases the privilege of a higher education, to be sure that we are giving something back and that we're reinvesting what was invested in us, the effort to get us to think. Because in the end, I mean, one of the great cliches of the day is, you know, critical thinking. Everybody talks about it, but very few people really know what it means, and even fewer people do it. So the point is that, you know, in higher education, we've got to get people to be really good at evaluating, really smart, perceptive. They should be good listeners. They should really hear what people are saying and identify what the problems are, and to feel the moral responsibility that Liz has talked about here, to do something, to play our part. We can't, as individuals, solve the problem, but we can certainly contribute to trying to solve the problem.
Can I ask you, Tasneem, you know, coming into this session, what do you feel an organisation like the University of Edinburgh, like us all sitting here, can actually achieve? What would you like to see happening in institutions and organisations like this?
Well, I think for one, this kind of conversation and the convening that you do is really critical. And I do think it would be important to have many of these diverse voices diverse perspectives and a very robust way of engaging each other and challenging each other. But more importantly, I think, you know, we need to understand, and this is not because we are being hopeless or pessimistic or anything. There's a reality that the kind of long-term business as usual approaches to everything in our society, including what we do in higher education, is going to have to turn entirely on its head. And so you're not going to be churning out the usual kind of thoughtful, of course, must always be thoughtful, but what I mean is we're going to have to get people going through higher education institutions coming out being active citizens, firstly, building that and using that power as part of wider collectives, because as Liz says, you know, individual, yeah, they matter, but collectives using power change things more. So how do you get higher education institutions to get sharper at how we build power, use power collectively? And then finally, of course, what we need for the future, and not even long-term futures. We're not talking about decades and decades and decades into the future. We need these solutions, these alternatives already generated now as we speak. And I think, you know, the points about not thinking in the usual way around development models, economic growth models, but the wonderful, wonderful opportunities to decentralize many of the kind of systems that we depend on for our well-being and for our dignity, etc. And I think there's really amazing work already being done in that field, and higher education institutions play a critical role in that as well.
Thank you so much. Now, we've just got a couple of minutes left. Have we got definitely a hand shot up there? I'm afraid this will probably be the last, just there, yeah. Last question from the floor.
Hi, yes.
Would you like to stand up? Sorry, could you stand up so we can see you? It's quite difficult from up here. Thank you.
It was mentioned about how Coca-Cola is advertising or sponsoring COP27. And I was just wondering what you thought about the fact that in COP26 and probably COP27, there's going to be meat served as well. And it's such a big problem because of agriculture. And I was wondering what you thought about how we all individuals need to change, and the fact that if meat is served at COP26, it also means that a lot of people attending COP26 are eating the meat. So what do you think about that?
It's a very good point. Shouldn't COP be leading by example? Would anyone on the panel like to comment on that? Yes, Tasneem?
Yeah, so I do want to make the point that, you know, the corporate interests that we're talking about are highly industrialized corporate interests. So what we have coming to COPs is a whole lot of interest from the agricultural sector, but big ag as we call it. And they have an influence on the discussions, the negotiations, the outcome. Do you know that at Glasgow COP, the highest delegation, the highest number of delegates, not negotiators, but people who came to the COP, was in fact from the fossil fuel industry, higher than country delegations. Coca-Cola sponsoring COP. In the past, it was actually fossil fuel companies sponsoring the COP. So what we need to be very clear about is there's this, of course, really important interventions that we as individuals can make in terms of lifestyle choices, in terms of our consumption patterns and all of that. But the biggest threat that we're dealing with is in fact big fossil fuel companies driving the climate crisis, big ag driving emissions as well in the way they do their agricultural business. So lifestyle choices, yes, but the big drivers of the climate crisis are in fact these big polluters, and their influence over UNFCCC processes are extremely worrying, and we should be actually worried about that, in addition to the choices we make as individuals.
Thank you so much, Tasneem. I'm going to take that as your final comment and just ask the rest of the panel to make a final comment on the discussion and the conversation. What haven't we covered? What do you want to say in conclusion? Arunabha.
You know, 80 years ago, there was a gentleman called B.R. Ambedkar who chaired India Constituent Assembly to draft constitution. Years ago, 40 suppressed community.
I'm so sorry.
So
Can
his mantra.
I'm so
Hear
sorry.
me?
I'm so sorry. We couldn't hear you. And you have, oh no, you're back with us, I think. Sorry, could you just restart and briefly contribute again? Sorry. It was just the connection.
All right, I'll keep it short. We are having this conversation in 2022. 80 years ago in 1942, a gentleman called B.R. Ambedkar, who then later on went on to lead the committee that drafted India's constitution, because he came from a group that was socially suppressed, gave a mantra: educate, agitate, organize. I think a lot of what we've discussed today is about educating ourselves about the science, agitating for change. But I think we've not solved for how we organize across borders to demonstrate that a different future is possible. Yesterday, my 10-year-old daughter, who's much wiser than I, had to do a little video for her school on what is the SDG that's most important to her. And she does this video and says, I think SDG 17 is the most important, because if you don't have partnerships, then how will you solve anything? So let's look 80 years hence and ask ourselves, in 2102, would we have organized ourselves better for a different future?
And we're running out of time, but would you like to make a final comment on what we've been discussing today?
Well, just very quickly, you know, things are going to change one way or the other. We are going to change them, we, the human race, and with our responsibilities for the globe and the future, or nature is going to do it to us. I'll give you a very, very quick example. One way of really helping things along would be to source our protein from not beef, chopping down the Amazon rainforest and, you know, running beef, but eating mealworms. Mealworms are not worms, by the way, they're larvae of a kind of black beetle. Very high in protein, very low in fat, very healthy, very, very ecological to produce. Now, if we could either switch to eating mealworms in sort of gourmet way, nice and hygienic and tasty and, you know, all that, or we're going to end up on our hands and knees looking for worms to eat when nature has made its decisions on our behalf. So we have a choice. Things are going to change. Are we going to be, to some extent, in control of the change or not? That is the big challenge in our world, and that's why it's so important that all the citizens and the people of the world should collectively get together and say, we've got to do something now.
Thank you so much, Liz. You got the opening word, now you get the final word.
Well, I think I will just pick up on that and say that I think that there is a particular moral imperative here for people who are my generation or older, because it is very easy, I think, to look at the young climate activists who are incredible. The leadership, the understanding of justice, the awareness that this is a global crisis is so strong and so evident among those. And there's a tendency, I think, to say, oh, aren't they amazing? They give us hope. And it's not their job to give us hope. I think we should be doing, and I say we, I mean people like me, should be doing all we can to support them and to uphold their voices, because I think that's the very least morally that we should be doing now.
Absolutely. And the one thing we know is that we can all do more. So thank you very much, everyone. 5 minutes, sorry, Chris. I'm going to now hand over to Professor Chris Speed for some closing remarks.
Hey, look, let's give him a round of applause. What a tremendous way into. Yeah?
Yeah.
Yes, oh. There's always a mark. There's always a mark. Look, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. That was terrific. And I've got to use my few crib sheets here as well. So thank you, Anthony, Elizabeth, Tasneem, Arunabha, and, of course, Patricia in absence, and, of course, Hermione for a great chairing. You managed to guide us through a whole bunch of things. Very, very good idiot. And, of course, Peter, the principal, who helps us really back these things. These things matter enormously to the university and ourselves. So, and thank you for the questions. And those online, your presence and part of this is really important. it's really fascinating, right? Unpacking this stuff and shifting the emphasis to justice or injustice, as you saw in the conversation, is vital. I'm left with this idea that we might bite into our next apple or our avocado and spend time literally tomorrow, tonight, thinking about where did the water come from? It wasn't so local. It probably was very, very far away. So those moments, those takeaways are really valued. We've got a lot to do. This is part of a three-part series in the conversations. So please just spend a minute with me while I recount those. And I'm hoping you're going to join us in person or online. We've got the next one is a performance with Kairani Baraka on the 14th of October, specially commissioned performance, poetry piece actually, which will be really asking questions of climate policy and finance. That's in conversation with Dr. Eza Adajari. And then a second one, the last one, which is on the 19th of October, Actions for Change in the systems themselves. And it's an online event, so you'll all be able to attend that one, with leaders including Elizabeth Bomberg, who's chairing, Kairani Baraka, Alice C. Hill, George Monboyat, Vanessa Nakate, Mitzi Janelle Tan, and Laura Young. And look, do attend. They're all on that QR code, which you're all sitting on. I'm hoping you're not quite sitting on them. But look, I'm the director of the Futures Institute, so to some extent, I'm here corralling, supporting, and guiding us into these conversations. The future does exist, trust me, and we've got 150 students here who arrived onto 6 programs just a few weeks ago, and I'm hoping many of you here today, representing that kind of action, that now, that people were speaking of earlier. So thank you for attending tonight. But we've also got the programs that you spoke of as well, which let me list them again before I get them wrong. I know Liz will kick me if I get them wrong. But we've got planetary health, we've got sustainable lands and cities, circular economy, and AI and data ethics, all just going through approval now, and then joining the many students who are already part of the existing programs next September. So it's going to be a busy time. By then, we might even be in the Royal Infirmary. So some fascinating histories and futures to deal with those. So thank you so much. Thanks for letting me finish off. I get the lucky break at the bookend. Thank you so much, panelists. And thank you, everyone in the audience. Have a great evening and keep thinking about the apples and avocados. Thank you very much.